3 times a day. The mountain man who walked in silence beside the brave nun. The first rays of the morning sun touched the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the rocks and snow in soft shades of gold. The air was crisp, almost sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wildflowers that had begun to bloom despite the early chill. In this quiet, remote land, life moved slowly. Breath. The villagers in the small settlements at the foothills of the mountains often woke before dawn, tending to goats, sheep, and small patches of barley. But far above them, where the land grew steeper and the wind sharper, the mountains held secrets that only a few ever dared to know. Among those secrets was a man who lived alone in the wilderness. He was known to the villagers as the Mountain Man. His real name had long faded from memory. Some said he had once belonged to their villages, that he had lived among them as a young boy and learned to speak, laugh, and work like anyone else. But something had changed him, something painful, some loss that had made him retreat to the mountains. For decades he had wandered the rocky paths, built a small shelter of stones and branches, hunted his own food, and carried out his life in complete solitude. He never spoke to anyone unless necessary, and even then, he spoke very little. His face, weathered and lined like the mountains themselves, gave little away, and yet there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength, a calm certainty that made people feel both uneasy and curious. It was on one of these crisp mornings that Sister Anara began her journey. She was a young nun, devoted to a simple but determined life. Her heart carried a desire to serve the villagers who lived in isolation, often cut off from the main roads, schools, and even basic medical care. Sepitea. She had trained at the monastery for years, learning not only prayers and rituals but also skills that would allow her to help people in practical ways. She carried a small pack filled with medicines, blankets, and some dried foods. Her shoes, sturdy but worn, crunched against the frost-hardened ground as she made her way up the narrow mountain trail. Her breath came out in soft clouds, mixing with the morning fog that clung to the pine trees. As she climbed higher, the trail grew narrower, winding around cliffs and over streams that gushed from melted snow. The sun was now higher in the sky, spilling light across the peaks and revealing a vast panorama of valleys, rocks, and distant forests. Birds began to call from the trees, their songs echoing strangely against the stone. Sister Anara moved carefully, knowing that one wrong step could send her tumbling down the slope. And she paused often, not just for rest, but to take in the silence that was more alive than any noise. It was then, around the third bend in the trail, that she first noticed him. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving among the rocks. But as she got closer, she saw the man clearly. Asar. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that had grown thick and gray over the years. His clothes were simple, patched together from old fabric, and he carried a walking stick, not for hunting, but for balance on the rocky paths. He did not wave, smile, or speak. He just stood there, his gaze calm, observing her. Desperate. Sister Anara felt a shiver, not of fear exactly, but of awe. She had heard stories from villagers about him, of course, but seeing him in person was different. He seemed like a part of the mountains themselves, as if he had grown out of the rocks, wind, and snow. Yet there was also a gentleness to him, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. Without thinking, she nodded politely, and he nodded back, a simple movement that carried more meaning than words could. From that day onward, their paths began to cross regularly. Every morning, noon, and evening, Sister Anara would see him somewhere along her route. Sometimes he was walking ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes resting on a flat rock, watching her pass. But at first she tried to speak to him, to ask who he was or why he lived alone in the mountains, but he never responded with words. Only a nod, a small smile, or a quiet glance. Over time she realized that the mountain man communicated in his own way, Not through speech, but through presence, through timing, and through subtle gestures that spoke of awareness, respect, and understanding. The villagers were intrigued by this unusual friendship. Some whispered that the nun had been bewitched by the mountain man's mysterious ways. Others were skeptical, thinking it strange that anyone could befriend someone so reclusive. But Sister Anara paid little attention. She had learned, during her time at the monastery, that understanding often required patience, observation, and humility. Some truths she had realized could not be forced or rushed. They had to be experienced quietly, just as the mountain man experienced life itself. Their routine became a rhythm. Each morning, Sister Anara would carry her supplies and follow the trail. The mountain man would appear somewhere along the way. They would walk together in silence, side by side, until she reached a point where she had to deliver food, medicine, or help to villagers living in the higher settlements. At noon, on her way back, she would meet him again. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped low behind the peaks and shadows stretched long across the trail, he would be there once more, walking beside her in perfect, unspoken companionship. 5. Despite the silence, a bond formed, began to leave small gifts along the trail for him, sometimes bread, sometimes a scarf, sometimes a flask of tea. She would place them carefully on a flat rock or under a tree, always noticing if he had accepted them the next time she saw him. And he always did, in his quiet, understated way. A nod, a glance, a small smile. Realized that courage and friendship did not always need words. Sometimes it was enough to walk beside someone through the trials of life, to share effort, time, and care. Narration. The mountains, harsh and beautiful, had a way of teaching lessons that could not be learned in towns or monasteries. And in the quiet rhythm of their 3 daily walks, both the mountain man and the brave nun discovered that connection could exist even in silence. As days turned into weeks, the trail, once lonely and forbidding, seemed to take on a new warmth. The birds sang a little louder, the sun shone a little brighter, and the rocks, snow, and wind felt less cold. The mountain man who had spent decades in isolation had found a companion of sorts. Not a friend in the traditional sense, but a witness to his life. Someone who recognized him without needing explanation. Pad. And Sister Anara, brave and determined, had found someone who reminded her that courage could be quiet, resilience could be unseen, and that life often held beauty in the smallest, simplest gestures. The villagers continued to watch, puzzled and fascinated. They saw a silent man walking beside a devoted nun 3 times a day and wondered at the story that tied them together. They could not see the depth of understanding that passed between them, the unspoken respect, or the quiet joy of companionship. Only the mountains, the wind, and the sun knew the full story of their meeting. A story that began with a glance, a nod, and the first step along a trail that would change both their lives forever. But writhing in the back. As the days passed, the rhythm of their silent companionship became a steady part of both their lives. Sister Anara would begin her climbs early in the morning, carrying her small pack of medicines, blankets, and food. The mountain air was sharp and cold, but it carried a certain freshness that could awaken even the sleepiest of hearts. Bah! The mountain man would appear at just the right moment along the trail, his tall, weathered figure blending with the rocks and trees, as if he had always been part of the mountains themselves. At first, Sister Anara had tried to speak to him, to ask simple questions. His name, how he lived, why he had chosen the mountains. But he never responded with words. Praise, a small nod, the tilt of his head, the direction of his eyes, or a gesture of his hands, all carried meaning. And slowly, she began to understand. Breaths. His silence was not coldness or disinterest. It was a careful, intentional way of being in the world. He listened in a way that words could never achieve, observing every movement, every subtle shift in the path or in her own steps. Each morning as they walked side by side, a quiet trust grew. Sister Anara learned to read his small gestures and anticipate his movements. If the path became treacherous, he would step ahead slightly, guiding her subtly without touching her. If she slowed down to adjust her pack or catch her breath, he would wait patiently, never rushing, never expressing impatience. And when the trail opened to a higher plateau, where the sun shone on a broad valley below, he would sometimes stop and glance toward the horizon, as if sharing a silent appreciation for the beauty of the mountains. By noon, when she carried supplies to the villagers living in more remote homes, she would often meet him again on her return. He never followed the same route exactly, but somehow they always encountered each other at certain points along the way. Sister Anara had started to leave small gifts for him during these encounters. Bread wrapped in cloth, a flask of hot tea, a scarf she had knitted herself. Each time she saw him again, she noticed that the gifts had been accepted, carefully placed in a small stone shelter, or worn quietly, without fanfare. Bao Samyan. She never spoke about the gifts to the villagers. She felt that such acts were private, shared only between her and the man who walked in silence. As the weeks turned into months, the villagers began to notice the strange and unusual bond, whispered their curiosity, questioning how a nun could walk with a man who never spoke and rarely interacted with anyone else. Others were skeptical or even wary, unsure of the mountain man's intentions, but the nun did not care about their opinions. She understood, in a way that villagers could not, that the connection she shared with him was based on something deeper than words. It was a mutual recognition of respect, patience, and understanding. On one particularly bright morning, a young boy from the village had wandered too far up the trail and slipped near a small stream. He cried out, and Sister Anara ran toward him, her heart pounding. The mountain man appeared almost instantly, moving with a grace and speed that belied his age. He reached the boy and steadied him, silently guiding him back to safety. The boy's parents were astonished, and the villagers murmured their amazement. The mountain man did not speak to explain himself. He simply nodded at Sister Anara, and then turned back to the trail, continuing his silent patrol as if nothing had happened. Sister Anara realized that courage and care did not always need words, that heroism could be quiet, deliberate, and unseen. Their walks became not just a routine, but a form of teaching for Sister Anara. She began to notice the details of the mountains, the changing patterns of snow and rock, the subtle shifts in the wind, the hidden trails that only someone who had lived there long enough could recognize. The mountain man seemed to know every stone, every tree, every hidden stream. When they walked together, she felt she was learning lessons about patience, observation, and humility. The mountains themselves had become their classroom, and the mountain man, in his quiet way, was a wise teacher. Evenings were perhaps the most peaceful part of their routine. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the valley in shades of pink and orange, they would walk together back toward the lower trail. The air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, but the presence of the mountain man brought a sense of calm. Sister Anara sometimes paused to look at him, noticing the faint lines of age and experience on his face, the strength in his hands, the quiet steadiness of his steps, breath. She wondered about the life he had lived in these mountains, about the hardships and sorrows that had led him to choose such isolation. And though she never asked directly, she felt that each walk, each shared moment was a small step toward understanding him. Over time, small acts of kindness became a part of their silent bond. Sometimes Sister Anara would leave a warm meal for him in a protected spot near a tree. Sometimes he would clear the path of loose rocks before she stepped on them. Once, when she had sprained her ankle slightly, she noticed that he had prepared a small makeshift support for her, carefully placing it near a resting spot without saying a word. Each gesture, no matter how small, carried meaning and deepened the unspoken trust between them. Sister Anara also began to feel a quiet joy in their companionship. Before meeting the mountain man, she had thought her journey would always be solitary and difficult. She had expected isolation, challenges, and long hours of effort without recognition or reward. Balance. Yet, walking side by side with him brought a sense of balance, as if the mountains themselves were smiling at their partnership. Their rhythm, morning, noon, and evening, created a sense of security and continuity. Perhaps she knew that, no matter what happened during her day, she would meet him along the trail, and in that meeting there was comfort and reassurance. The villagers continued to watch with curiosity and sometimes admiration. They had begun to speak of the mountain man not just as a recluse, but as someone who had a purpose, someone who carried strength and wisdom quietly. Sister Inara's courage and dedication also became more evident as she ventured farther into the mountains to reach those in need. Breath. And while the villagers could not always understand the silent bond she shared with the mountain man, they began to respect it, recognizing that some forms of companionship and support are beyond explanation. As spring approached, the mountains slowly transformed. Snow melted, streams swelled, and flowers bloomed along the trails. The sunlight became warmer, and the air carried the scent of growth and renewal. Sister Inara noticed how the mountain man seemed to be more attuned to these changes than anyone else, moving with a rhythm that mirrored the natural world. Their silent walks now felt like a celebration of life itself, a recognition of survival, resilience, and the quiet joys that come from observing and respecting the world around them. Through all of this, one lesson became increasingly clear to Sister Inara. Words are not the only way to connect with another human being. The mountain man had taught her that understanding, trust, and care could exist in silence. Each shared step, each small gesture, each unspoken acknowledgement was more powerful than any conversation. They walked side by side not because they needed to speak, but because they needed to witness each other's presence, and in that presence they found meaning and purpose. By the end of the season, their story had begun to take shape in the hearts of those who observed it. Bray, the nun who traveled the mountains 3 times a day, and the silent hermit who walked beside her had become symbols of quiet strength, compassion, and resilience. And while the villagers did not know the full depth of their bond, they understood that something extraordinary was happening in the mountains, a story of friendship and courage that needed no words, only the steady rhythm of shared steps and shared presence. Spring was gradually giving way to summer, and the mountains had become alive with colors, scents, and sounds. The streams gurgled faster as snow melted from the higher peaks, and the warm breeze carried the faint fragrance of wildflowers that had begun to bloom in hidden corners of the trails. Sister Inara continued her routine with quiet dedication, making her way up the narrow winding paths with her pack of supplies. Each morning, noon, and evening she expected, and found, the mountain man somewhere along the trail, waiting silently, his presence steady as the mountains themselves. It was during one of her morning walks that she noticed a change. The trail had become more difficult than usual. Overnight rain had loosened the soil, and small rocks littered the narrow path, making her steps uncertain. She felt the strain in her legs, and her breath came faster as she adjusted the weight of her pack. The mountain man walked beside her as always, his eyes carefully scanning the ground, as if noting each obstacle before it could affect her. She had grown used to his quiet vigilance, and it comforted her. Perhaps, somehow without words, he had become a guide, a protector, and a companion all at once. That day, a landslide had blocked a portion of the trail she normally used to deliver supplies to a small village higher up the mountain. Large rocks had tumbled down, creating a wall that seemed impossible to climb or move. Sister Inara's heart sank. Many villagers depended on her deliveries, and she could not turn back. She studied the rocks, searching for a way forward, but nothing seemed safe. Her eyes met the mountain man's, and she could feel his quiet reassurance. He did not speak, but he moved with calm determination toward a narrower, less obvious path that wound around the blocked section. Following him was not easy. The alternate trail was steep and overgrown with low shrubs and loose stones, bark. Sister Anara's legs ached, and her hands scraped against the rough bark of trees she clutched for balance. The mountain man walked ahead, moving with careful, deliberate steps, always returning to make sure she could follow safely. At one point, a particularly large stone gave way under her weight, and she stumbled. Without hesitation, he reached out, not to touch her directly, but to position a branch for her to grasp and steady herself. Breaths of death and Missy, prepared to process as if he had practiced. Bad air AI. As if he had practiced the sunlight, scamp. As they climbed, Sister Anara noticed something else. The mountain man's silence seemed even more profound during the climb. Breath. He never complained, never hurried, and never looked frustrated. He simply observed and acted when necessary. She began to think about what it must be like to live alone for so long, to rely only on yourself and the environment around you. Perhaps his silence was not just a choice, but a way of communicating without the distractions of words. Each gesture, each glance, each careful movement carried meaning, and she had learned to interpret them. Hours passed as they navigated the difficult path. Apparatus. Sister Anara's pack felt heavier, and the sun climbed higher, beating down on the rocky trail. Yet she did not falter. There was something in the mountain man's presence that strengthened her resolve. It was as if he reminded her that fear, fatigue, and uncertainty could be met with quiet courage, patience, and careful thought. Whenever she felt overwhelmed, a glance at him, steady and unflinching, gave her reassurance. She realized that strength could be silent, and bravery could exist without recognition. By late afternoon, they reached the village at the top of the alternate path. The villagers were surprised to see her arrive, especially after the landslide. Many had worried that she might not make it. Sister Anara delivered the supplies and attended to a few minor injuries with her medicines, all while quietly observing the mountain man. Watch. He remained just outside the small cluster of homes, leaning on his walking stick, watching the interactions, yet never intruding. Even among people, he seemed at ease without speaking, fully present without seeking attention. As they began their return journey, a sudden summer storm rolled in. Dark clouds gathered over the peaks, and the first drops of rain fell, quickly turning into a cold, steady downpour. Sister Anara's clothes soaked through, and the slippery rocks made her footing treacherous. The mountain man moved closer, walking beside her with steady, confident steps. His knowledge of the terrain became crucial. For points where the path narrowed dangerously, he guided her with subtle gestures, a gentle tap of his stick, or a look in the direction she should step. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, and safe. The rain continued for hours, and the trail grew even more perilous. Sister Anara's thoughts flickered between fear and awe. Bah! She realized that the mountain man had spent decades in these mountains, mastering not just survival but the art of moving safely in a dangerous environment. He seemed to anticipate every obstacle before it appeared, and yet he did so without a single word, without any demand or expectation, only with quiet care. She felt a deep gratitude and respect for him, more than words could express. By evening, as the storm began to subside, they reached a sheltered area beneath a cluster of trees. Sister Anara, shivering and exhausted, rested against a large rock. Parade. The mountain man sat nearby, also quiet, but his presence seemed to warm the space around them. She looked at him and realized that this shared trial, climbing steep paths, facing landslides, enduring the storm, had created a bond stronger than any conversation could have. Silence, she understood, could carry as much meaning as speech, especially when shared in moments of trust, courage, and challenge. That night, as they continued down the trail toward the lower village, Sister Anara reflected on what she had learned. The mountain man had lived a life of solitude, yet he had taught her more about courage, resilience, and patience than any lesson she had received at the monastery. Each step he guided her through, each risk he helped her navigate, was a lesson in quiet heroism. Briar. She began to write notes about their journey, careful not to intrude on his privacy, but wanting to remember the ways in which he had silently shaped her understanding of strength and companionship. Over the following weeks, similar trials occurred. To them, dusty landslides, sudden fog made trails nearly invisible, and steep climbs tested their endurance. Each time the mountain man guided Sister Inara without hesitation. He seemed to understand that her mission to deliver supplies and help the villagers was important, and he moved with a purpose that balanced caution with determination. Sister Inara grew more confident in her own abilities, but she also recognized that his guidance was invaluable. Together they formed a rhythm that combined human perseverance with intimate knowledge of the natural world. The villagers began to notice the effects of these journeys. They saw Sister Inara arriving safely, even when conditions seemed impossible, and they saw the mountain man walking beside her, silent but reliable. Some began to bring small offerings of thanks, bread, fresh fruits, or handmade items, but the mountain man accepted them only with a nod, never seeking attention or recognition. Sister Inara realized that his satisfaction came not from praise but from the act of being present, of helping in ways that mattered without fanfare. Through these trials, some mutual understanding deepened. Sister Inara learned to anticipate his movements, to follow subtle cues, and to move in harmony with the natural flow of the mountains. The mountain man, in turn, began to seem more attuned to her needs, pausing at just the right moments, offering silent reassurance, and guiding her through challenges with patience and precision. Bond, though unspoken, grew stronger with each shared trial, teaching them both that courage, trust, and friendship could exist even without words. By the end of the season, they had faced many challenges together. Landslides, storms, slippery paths, and exhaustion. But each had emerged stronger, more aware, and more connected. Sister Inara realized that these trials were not simply obstacles, but opportunities. They revealed the strength of the mountain man, the resilience within herself, and the unique power of silent companionship. Every step along the mountain trails had become a lesson, a story, and a shared experience that neither would forget. Winter had begun to creep into the mountains, bringing shorter days, sharper winds, and colder nights. Snow dusted the peaks and the higher trails, turning the familiar paths into a white, slippery maze. Sister Inara continued her walks with her usual dedication, carrying blankets, dried food, and medicines to the remote villages perched high on the mountainside. Despite the harsh weather, she remained steadfast, knowing that people relied on her deliveries and care. Each morning, noon, and evening, she expected to see the mountain man, and he never failed to appear. His silent presence had become a comfort, a constant in the unpredictable world of the mountains. One particularly bitter morning, the snow had turned thick, and a strong wind swept down the narrow valleys. Sister Inara trudged carefully, the cold biting through her thin gloves, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Her path was treacherous. Snow covered loose rocks and hidden patches of ice made her footing uncertain. As she climbed, she realized that the weight of her supplies made every step a challenge. She paused frequently, adjusting her pack and catching her breath, knowing that any misstep could be dangerous. It was during one of these pauses that she realized something was wrong. Her chest ached, and she felt unusually weak, as if the cold and exertion were more than she could bear. She tried to continue, forcing herself to take another step, but her legs trembled and her vision blurred. Panic began to rise inside her. But then she felt a familiar presence beside her. The mountain man had arrived without her noticing, appearing like a shadow among the snow-covered rocks. He did not speak, but his eyes were steady and calm, a silent assurance that she was not alone. Understanding her difficulty, he guided her to a nearby shelter, a small abandoned hut that he had used in the past during storms. He moved with a quiet urgency, supporting her without words, showing a careful attention that spoke volumes. Sister Anara leaned against the wall of the hut, shivering and exhausted, while the mountain man worked quickly. Wow. He gathered dry twigs and kindling, starting a small fire that slowly warmed the air. He prepared a place for her to rest, laying down blankets and offering a flask of warm tea, which she accepted with trembling hands. As she sipped the tea, her mind began to clear. She realized that she had underestimated the power of the mountain winter, but she also felt a deep gratitude for the mountain man. He had always been silent, always present, and now his presence had saved her from serious danger. She watched him, noticing the careful way he moved, his hands steady and skilled from years of living alone in these harsh conditions. Decades, facing storms, hunger, and isolation, and yet he remained calm, focused, and compassionate. That night, as the storm raged outside, Sister Anara began to sense the depth of his life story. She had always known that he had retreated from the villages, but she had never understood why. Watching him work quietly to keep the fire going, ensuring her comfort and safety, she realized that his silence had been a choice made out of grief and loss. Friend, he had endured pain, but he had also found strength in solitude. And now he had chosen to share a part of that strength with her, guiding her, protecting her, and walking beside her without ever speaking. The mountain man did not speak of his past that night. Instead, he communicated through gestures, careful movements, and attentive care. Sister Anara began to see how much trust was involved in their relationship. She had come to the mountains to help others, but in many ways she was learning from him. Learning patience, resilience, and the quiet courage that comes from living close to nature and understanding its challenges. Their bond, though unspoken, grew stronger with each shared experience. The next morning the storm had eased, leaving a world covered in fresh snow that sparkled under the weak winter sun. Sister Anara felt stronger but still cautious. She wrapped herself in blankets and prepared to continue her journey, knowing that the villagers awaited her supplies. The mountain man walked beside her, his eyes scanning the trail ahead, anticipating hazards, and adjusting his steps to protect both of them. She realized that their relationship had evolved beyond simple companionship. He was not just a guide. He had become a protector, a teacher, and a silent friend who understood her in ways that words could never express. As they moved along the trail, Sister Anara began to reflect on the lessons she had learned from him. She had always believed that courage was loud, visible, and heroic. But the mountain man had shown her that true courage often lived in quiet, careful action. Heroism did not always require words or recognition. It could exist in the simple, steady act of walking alongside someone, guiding them through danger, and offering care without expectation. She felt a growing admiration for him, and also a sense of humility, recognizing how much she still had to learn about life, resilience, and human connection. Their journey continued through the snow-covered trails, each step requiring careful attention. Menon noticed how he seemed to read the landscape like a living map, anticipating where the snow might give way, where hidden rocks could be dangerous, and where the trail might narrow unexpectedly. She realized that his long life in solitude had given him an extraordinary awareness of his surroundings, a skill that was now invaluable to her. They moved in harmony, each aware of the other, communicating in ways that did not require words but were no less meaningful. That afternoon they reached the village where Sister Anara delivered her supplies. The villagers were amazed to see her arrive safely after the storm, and their gratitude was evident in their expressions and gestures. Provided food, blankets, and medicines, tending to minor injuries and illnesses with careful attention. The mountain man remained outside observing quietly, yet his presence seemed to reassure everyone. But the villagers could sense his strength, his calm, and his reliability. After the deliveries, they began their journey back down the mountain. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the snow, and the air was colder than before. Sister Anara moved cautiously, her legs tired but steady. The mountain man walked beside her, guiding her through patches of ice and loose stones, his every movement deliberate and careful. She realized that she had come to rely on him not only for physical guidance, but for emotional support. His quiet presence gave her confidence, courage, and a sense of safety that she had never felt alone in the mountains. That evening, as they settled in a small shelter near a cluster of trees, Sister Inara finally understood something important. The mountain man's silence was not emptiness. It was a language of its own. It carried wisdom, empathy, and understanding. He had chosen solitude to survive pain, but he had chosen to walk with her to share strength. Their shared experiences, trials, and quiet moments had created a bond that transcended words. She felt honored to be part of it, and grateful for the lessons it offered. Over the next few days, they continued their routine, facing smaller storms, slippery trails, and challenges that tested their endurance and resolve, reinforced the lessons they had already begun to learn from one another: patience, resilience, trust, and the power of silent companionship. Sister Inara began to notice subtle changes in the mountain man as well. Though he remained quiet, there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at her, a small acknowledgement of the connection they shared. She realized that even someone who had lived in isolation for decades could find meaning and joy in companionship, even without words. By the end of the season, their bond had grown deeper than either could have imagined. The mountain man had not only guided and protected her through physical challenges, but had also revealed the emotional strength that comes from living with purpose and intention. Sister Inara had learned to walk with courage, patience, and awareness, and in turn she had offered him a sense of companionship and trust that he had not experienced in years. Together they had created a rhythm, a silent language of presence, care, and understanding that neither storms, snow, nor mountains could break. Through it all, Sister Inara reflected on the profound lesson she had learned: that true connection does not always require words. Sometimes it exists in shared struggles, in the steady rhythm of walking side by side, in silent gestures of care and protection. She understood that the mountain man's life had been shaped by loss, solitude, and hardship, yet he had chosen to share a part of that strength with her. In return, she offered her trust, her courage, and her unwavering dedication to the people of the mountains. Together they had discovered a bond that was quiet, resilient, and enduring, one that would remain long after the snow had melted and the mountains returned to their usual calm, bringing with it the promise of warmer days, melting snow, and the gentle hum of life returning to the valleys. The streams flowed with clearer water, the birds sang louder, and the valleys began to sparkle with the green of new grass. Sister Inara continued her journeys as usual, carrying supplies, blankets, and medicines to villages that were still isolated from the main roads. Though her days were long and the climbs exhausting, she felt a quiet joy in the work she was doing. And as always, the mountain man was there, appearing along the trail with his calm presence, walking beside her silently 3 times a day. By now, their routine had become more than habit. It was a rhythm, a shared understanding that required no words. The mountain man no longer felt like a mysterious figure of the mountains to her. He was a companion, a teacher, and a source of quiet strength. Sister Inara had learned to move in harmony with him, to read his gestures and expressions, and to trust his instincts in bad. Their relationship had grown in subtle ways: a shared glance at a dangerous patch of ice, a small adjustment of her pack without needing to ask, the simple act of walking together without speaking, yet understanding each other completely. The villagers, too, had begun to understand the importance of this unusual friendship. They noticed how Sister Inara arrived safely, even during difficult weather, and how the mountain man seemed to appear whenever she needed him. Some were curious, some cautious, and some deeply respectful. They began to leave small gifts at the trailhead: a loaf of bread, fresh fruits, a knitted scarf. Though the mountain man accepted them silently, showing no sign of pride or acknowledgement. The Sister Anara realized that he did not seek praise or recognition. The quiet satisfaction of helping someone, of walking with purpose, was enough. One morning, as they climbed a steep trail toward a small village perched high on a rocky ledge, Sister Anara noticed something unusual. Children from the village had gathered near the path, waving and calling out. Brassed. She smiled and waved back, and even the mountain man paused to acknowledge them with a slight nod. The villagers had begun to see him not as a frightening or mysterious figure, but as a protector, someone who carried strength and wisdom quietly. Sister Anara felt a sense of pride and humility. Their shared efforts had not only helped her reach the villages safely, but they had also shown the people that courage and kindness could exist in forms beyond words. As they continued along the trail, Sister Anara reflected on how far they had come together. The mountain man had guided her through storms, landslides, and treacherous paths. He had taught her lessons about patience, courage, resilience, and the power of silent companionship. She had learned that trust could be earned through actions, not just words, and that friendship did not always require conversation. Each shared moment on the mountain trails had deepened their bond, creating a rhythm that neither would forget. During one of their afternoon walks, the mountain man led her to a quiet plateau overlooking a wide valley below. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of pink, orange, and gold. Her Sister Anara paused, taking in the view, and noticed the small gestures he made, pointing with his hand toward a distant peak, adjusting the path of her steps to avoid loose stones, and moving with a steady, deliberate rhythm. She realized that these moments, though silent, were filled with care, thoughtfulness, and shared understanding. The mountains themselves seemed to honor their companionship, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude. That evening, as they descended the trail together, the mountain man performed a gesture that Sister Anara had not seen before. He placed a small, smooth stone into her hand, a simple act that carried meaning she could feel but not put into words. Ask. She held the stone carefully, understanding that it symbolized trust, respect, and the bond they had formed. It was a reminder that their connection went beyond daily walks or practical assistance. It was a recognition of shared humanity, of understanding without speaking, and of loyalty and care that endured even in the harshest conditions. The following weeks were marked by continued work, but also by reflection. Sister Anara began to record their journey in a notebook, carefully documenting the lessons she had learned, the challenges they had faced, and the quiet moments that had shaped both of them. Wrote about the landslides, the storms, and the treacherous paths, but also about the gestures, the silent guidance, and the unspoken conversations that had defined their bond. She understood that their story was not just about survival or service. It was about connection, resilience, and the extraordinary power of walking side by side through life's challenges. One afternoon they reached a particularly difficult section of the trail, where a narrow ledge overlooked a deep ravine. Sister Anara's steps were careful, but her heart raced with the danger. Bantos. The mountain man moved ahead slightly, his presence calming her without needing to touch her. He scanned the trail, identified safe footholds, and guided her with subtle gestures. Each step felt deliberate and precise, and she realized that she had come to trust his judgment completely. The silent rhythm they had established over months of walking together allowed her to navigate even the most dangerous paths with confidence and calm. By the end of the season, their story had spread quietly among the villagers and travelers who occasionally crossed the mountains. They spoke of the brave nun who walked tirelessly to serve isolated communities, and of the silent mountain man who always appeared to guide and protect her. BB. People came to understand that heroism was not always loud, that friendship could exist without words, and that courage could be measured in quiet acts of care and presence. The mountain man's life, once hidden in solitude, had found purpose and meaning through this bond, and Sister Anara's work had become even more impactful because of his guidance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the valley below was bathed in golden light, Sister Anara and the mountain man paused at a familiar resting spot. The wind carried the scent of pine and blooming flowers, and the quiet of the mountains was profound. Obsession. She looked at him, noticing the lines of age and experience etched into his face, and she understood that their journey had changed both of them. He had shown her that courage could be quiet, that heroism could be silent, and that deep connections could exist without words. Perhaps, in return, she had offered him trust, companionship, and shared purpose, a reminder that even those who choose solitude can find meaning in walking beside another human being. The mountain man continued his solitary walks, but the rhythm of their shared steps had left a permanent mark on him. He no longer seemed entirely isolated. He had discovered the subtle joy of companionship, the satisfaction of helping someone, and the quiet pride of shared achievement. Sister Anara returned to her monastery from time to time, carrying stories of the mountains, the villages, and the lessons she had learned from walking silently beside him. She recorded their journey, not for fame or recognition, but to preserve the memory of what they had shared and the lessons it offered to anyone willing to listen, observe, and learn. Even as years passed, the villagers continued to speak of the nun and the mountain man. Travelers who ventured into the mountains would occasionally catch a glimpse of the tall, silent figure walking along the trails, always beside the young woman who had inspired communities with her courage. The story became a quiet legend, a reminder that true bravery and compassion are often expressed through deeds rather than words, and that meaningful connections can be forged in the most unexpected places. Inspiration tired. Sister Anara often thought of him, remembering their first meeting along the winding trail, the silent companionship they had shared through storms, landslides, and long winter nights. She realized that their story was not just about survival or service. It was about human connection, trust, and resilience. It was about the extraordinary power of walking side by side, supporting each other in silence, and finding meaning in the simplest of gestures. The mountain man had taught her lessons she would carry for the rest of her life. That courage could exist quietly, that trust could be built without words, and that even in the harshest conditions, friendship could thrive in the presence of care, respect, and understanding. Their story, though unspoken and simple, became a lasting legacy. It reminded the villagers, the travelers, and even Sister Anara herself that heroism does not always announce itself, that connection does not always require conversation, and that the most profound bonds are often those forged in silence, through shared challenges, and by walking together 3 times a day through the mountains of life.